The hum of the server room was Peter's lullaby. For 10 years, it had been the soundtrack to his life, a constant, low thrumming reassurance that something, somewhere, was whirring along efficiently. Peter wasn't the kind of guy who needed applause. He was the kind of guy who made sure the lights stayed on, the code compiled, and the world-changing product, the one he'd been nurturing in the dim fluorescent glow of his cubicle, actually worked. He was the invisible architect, the silent engine, the guy who remembered where the spare toner cartridges were kept when the entire marketing department was about to have a collective meltdown over a printer jam. His project? They called it Phoenix, a bold, almost audacious name for something that was designed to resurrect the company from its dying embers. Its potential was so astronomical, so undeniably game-changing, that its very existence had become a carefully guarded secret, known only to Peter and a select few on the executive floor. He'd poured years into it, sacrificing weekends, missing birthdays, fueled by lukewarm coffee, and the unwavering belief that this was the one. This was what he was put on earth to do. His boss, Paul, was a different breed entirely. Paul was a creature of polished mahogany and aggressively meaningless buzzwords. He was the kind of manager who mistook frantic activity for productivity and loud pronouncements for actual strategic thinking. Paul hadn't created a single groundbreaking idea in his life. He was a curator of other people's brilliance, a repackager of innovation, a master of the strategic pivot that always seemed to land him exactly where he wanted to be, on top. And Peter's Phoenix project? It was a threat. Not because Paul understood its technical intricacies, he wouldn't know a blockchain from a garden hoe, but because its success would inevitably overshadow Paul's carefully constructed edifice of self-importance. It would make Peter, the quiet guy in the third cubicle from the window, more valuable than Paul, the self-proclaimed visionary. And that, for Paul, was an intolerable offense. The sabotage began subtly, like a slow leak in a pressure vessel. First, access to the advanced simulation software was suddenly, temporarily suspended due to unforeseen licensing issues. Peter, ever the pragmatist, just found a workaround. Then, critical data feeds from the research department, the very lifeblood of Phoenix, started arriving late, corrupted, or not at all. He'd politely inquire, his voice measured and calm, and be met with a flurry of apologetic emails from HR citing network upgrades and system overhauls. The language was always professional, always plausible, but Peter, who meticulously documented every line of code, every data input, saw the pattern. It was like watching a chef systematically remove ingredients from his pantry one by one until the dish was ruined. Paul's strategy was simple: starve the project, then blame the chef. He enlisted HR, a woman named Brenda, whose smile was as brittle as a stale wafer and whose understanding of employee well-being was as deep as a puddle after a brief shower. Brenda was Paul's echo chamber, his enforcer, the one who could translate his petty vendettas into official corporate policy. Together, they painted a picture of Peter as an uncooperative recluse, a lone wolf who refused to share his precious insights. They whispered about his lack of synergy, his unwillingness to engage in collaborative ideation. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, designed to isolate and discredit. The final act was swift and brutal, a curt summons to a sterile conference room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken accusations. Paul sat across from him, radiating an almost theatrical magnanimity. Brenda, beside him, had that serene, detached look of someone about to deliver bad news with surgical precision. "Peter," Paul began, his voice dripping with feigned regret, "this wasn't an easy decision. But we've had to make some tough calls regarding team restructuring. Your contributions have been noted. However, your performance metrics, particularly in terms of collaborative output and team integration, haven't met the evolving needs of the company." Evolving needs, collaborative output, team integration. The buzzwords landed like small, sharp stones. Peter's mind, however, was already miles away, not in despair, but in calculation. He'd seen this coming, of course. He'd anticipated the possibility, the probability even, and he had prepared. Brenda slid a manila folder across the table. Inside, a termination letter, penned with the impersonal language of corporate detachment. Due to irreconcilable differences in your approach to teamwork and company objectives, it read, "Your employment is terminated effective immediately." It listed a severance package that was insultingly meager, a footnote to his decade of dedication. "We need your company laptop, your badge, and any other company property returned today," Brenda added, her voice devoid of empathy. Peter looked at the folder, then at Paul's smug face, then at Brenda's impassive mask. He felt no anger, no sadness, only a quiet, cold clarity. He reached into his worn messenger bag and placed his company ID badge on the table. Then, he pulled out a small, nondescript USB drive. "This," he said, his voice calm and even, "contains all proprietary documentation, research data, and code related to Project Phoenix. I'm returning it as requested." He paused, a subtle shift in his gaze, a flicker of something that Paul, in his arrogance, failed to recognize. "However, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who actually owns the intellectual property developed on this project." Paul chuckled, a dismissive, patronizing sound. Peter, that's company property. You know that. All intellectual property developed during your employment belongs to us. Standard clause." "Indeed," Peter replied, standing up. He looked Paul directly in the eye. "But not all intellectual property is developed during employment, Paul. Some is developed independently, with personal resources, meticulously documented and safeguarded. And some intellectual property agreements have very specific clauses about termination without cause and reversion of IP." Paul's smirk faltered for a split second. Brenda shifted in her seat, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around her lips. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected meek compliance, perhaps a tearful plea. They hadn't expected knowledge. "I'll be leaving now," Peter continued, his tone final. "Thank you for the opportunity to have worked here, though I must say your HR policies could use a significant update, particularly regarding the definition of team player." He walked out of the conference room, leaving Paul and Brenda in a stunned silence, the flimsy termination letter on the table like a discarded piece of confetti. The receptionist looked up as he passed, her expression a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Peter offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look back. The walk to his car was different than he'd imagined. No dramatic storm clouds, no swelling orchestral score, just the mundane reality of a Tuesday afternoon, the sun bright, the traffic noisy. But inside him, a different kind of storm was brewing. Not one of destruction, but of calculated reconstruction. He drove not straight home, but to a small, unassuming storage unit on the outskirts of town. It was a place most people would overlook, a forgotten corner of the city. But for Peter, it was his sanctuary. Inside, under a false panel, was his secret. Not a weapon of mass destruction, but something far more potent in the corporate world. A fully equipped, custom-built research lab. State-of-the-art servers, advanced computational equipment, a secure network, all meticulously assembled over the past 5 years, with his own money, his own time, his own obsessive dedication. And in a secure, encrypted digital vault, accessible only by him, was his true leverage. A comprehensive, meticulously detailed report of Project Phoenix, dating back to its inception. Every experiment, every failed iteration, every breakthrough, every line of code, every financial investment he'd made from his own pocket to keep the project alive when the company's funding had mysteriously dried up. He'd anticipated this. He'd anticipated their short-sightedness, their greed, their petty vindictiveness. He'd anticipated their attempt to steal his life's work. He opened his laptop, the familiar glow of the screen, a comforting contrast to the sterile, soulless conference room he'd just left. He navigated through layers of encryption, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He pulled up the Phoenix Project Master Log document. Thousands of pages, meticulously cross-referenced, time-stamped, and verified. It wasn't just a record, it was an indictment. He scrolled through the entries, a faint smile playing on his lips. There was the initial concept proposal filed under his personal domain before it was ever pitched to the company. There were the receipts for the specialized software licenses he'd purchased himself when the company claimed they couldn't afford them. There were the emails, dozens of them, politely requesting access to resources that were inexplicably denied. There was the digital fingerprint of every single breakthrough, every line of code that formed the backbone of what Paul and Brenda believed was their company's secret weapon. He closed the logbook, a sense of calm washing over him. They had fired him, yes. They had tried to erase him, to claim his creation. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. Peter always played the long game, and he always kept receipts. The game wasn't over, it had just begun. And this time, he was playing by his own rules, on his own turf. The silence of his private lab was a stark contrast to the hollow echoes of the corporate office. And in that silence, a new strategy began to form. They thought they had won. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The hum of the server room, once a comfort, was now a distant memory. Peter sat in the quiet solitude of his private lab, the low thrum of his own high-powered machines a more satisfying symphony. The sterile conference room, the feigned sympathy of Paul, Brenda's clipped pronouncements, they had all been a prologue. Now, the real story was about to unfold, written not in corporate jargon, but in meticulously organized data. He opened the central logbook. It was a testament to his foresight, a digital monument built stone by digital stone. Each entry was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and validated. The initial proposal for Project Phoenix filed under his personal cloud storage before it was even a whisper in the executive boardroom. He pulled up the financial records, not the company's, but his own. The receipts for the specialized software licenses he'd purchased out of pocket when the company cited budget constraints. The invoices for the high-speed network upgrades he'd installed in his own home to ensure the stability of the data streams. The emails, dozens of them, to Paul and Brenda, politely requesting resources that were inexplicably denied, always met with vague apologies about system overhauls and unforeseen technical difficulties. He created a separate folder labeled Breach of Contract. Inside, he began to systematically upload every communication that highlighted the deliberate obstruction of his work. The sudden technical glitch that corrupted a month's worth of simulation data, the unexpected server maintenance that conveniently occurred every time he needed to access a critical data set, the deliberate misdirection of key research findings from other departments. He wasn't just documenting sabotage, he was building a case for intellectual property theft and constructive dismissal. He paused, a grim satisfaction blooming in his chest. Paul and Brenda had prided themselves on their ability to manipulate perception, to craft narratives. They had spun a tale of Peter's lack of teamwork, his isolation. But Peter had simply documented the reality, a project starved and sabotaged by those who feared its success. He uploaded the encrypted video logs from his personal security camera, capturing the hushed conversations between Paul and Brenda in the hallway, their smug pronouncements about managing Peter out. He had them on record, in their own words, detailing their plan to discredit him. Then he moved to the IP reversion clauses. He pulled up his original employment contract, the one he'd signed on his first day, a decade ago. He'd insisted on the inclusion of a specific clause, a safeguard he'd felt was prudent even then, though he never imagined it would be so crucial. He cross-referenced it with the company's updated IP policy, highlighting the subtle shifts that Brenda and the legal team had implemented over the years, shifts designed to strengthen their claim on employee-generated IP, but which in his case had inadvertently created loopholes. He had meticulously documented every step, every iteration, every financial outlay that belonged to him, not the company. He leaned back, a quiet confidence settling over him. The company, no doubt, was basking in their perceived victory. They thought they had rid themselves of a problem, a threat to Paul's fragile ego. They were celebrating the restructuring that had led to Peter's termination. But they were celebrating a moment of their own hubris, a moment of blindness. A few days passed. Peter continued his work, refining his documentation, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight, irrefutable. He allowed a calculated silence to settle over his departure, a silence that would eventually become deafening. Then, the first ripple reached him, a hushed text message from Sarah, a former colleague in engineering, someone he'd always maintained a professional, albeit distant, respect for. Peter, you won't believe this. The integration with the new logistics module is completely broken. We're losing shipments. They can't figure out why. It's like the whole system just stopped talking to itself. He replied with a simple, understood. The next day, another message, this time from David in accounting, a man known for his unflappability. Peter, are you sure you didn't leave any dependencies active? Our Q3 projections are in free fall. The supply chain analytics are just spitting out garbage. Paul's been on a rampage. No one can find the root cause. Peter typed, I'll look into it. He didn't. Not yet. He let the panic build, let them scramble. He knew what the root cause was. The logistics module had been designed to interface seamlessly with a specific proprietary data processing algorithm, an algorithm he had developed, an algorithm that was now locked behind his personal encrypted servers. They had bypassed it in their rush to replace him, opting for a cheaper, less integrated solution, and in doing so had severed the critical link that held their entire operational chain together. He received a frantic email from Brenda, a mass mailing that was clearly born of desperation, subject, urgent, Project Phoenix Data Integrity Crisis. The body was a cascade of corporate buzzwords and barely veiled panic. Team, we are experiencing unprecedented data discrepancies within the Phoenix project infrastructure. We require immediate assistance from all personnel with historical knowledge of the system's architecture. Please share any relevant documentation or insights that may assist in resolving these critical issues. Your prompt cooperation is paramount to our continued success. He chuckled. Historical knowledge. They had systematically erased him from that history, and now they were begging for his ghost to return. He didn't reply. He just forwarded the email to a new folder labeled Irony. The pressure mounted. Whispers reached him through former colleagues who were still clinging to their jobs. Paul was reportedly losing his temper in meetings, shouting about sabotage and unforeseen technical failures. Brenda was seen making frantic calls, her usual brittle composure shattered. The company's stock, which had been on a steady climb, began to falter. Clients, who had been eagerly awaiting the full rollout of Phoenix, started making inquiries, their tone shifting from anticipation to concern. Then, the definitive communication arrived. Not a polite request, but a legal demand. A formal letter from the company's legal counsel delivered via courier. It cited Peter's termination, the company's understanding of his intellectual property contributions, and a stern demand for the return of any and all proprietary information related to Project Phoenix that he might still possess. It was signed by the chief legal officer, a man Peter had never met, a man whose name was synonymous with aggressive litigation. Peter picked up the letter, a faint smile playing on his lips. They had finally played their hand. They had underestimated his preparedness, his meticulousness, his willingness to play the long game. They had expected a broken man begging for crumbs. They were about to receive a lesson in corporate karma. He opened his email client. He selected the chief legal officer, copied Brenda from HR, and CC'd Paul, who was still listed as his former department head, just for good measure. He attached a single PDF. The subject line read, Response to Inquiry Project Phoenix IP. The PDF was titled Project Phoenix Comprehensive IP Documentation and Ownership Record. Inside, it laid out Peter's case with irrefutable clarity. His initial concept proposals, dated years before the project was officially sanctioned by the company, the detailed logs of his personal investment, the software, the hardware, the time, all meticulously accounted for. The correspondence outlining the company's denial of critical resources and the deliberate obstruction of his progress, the patent filings he had initiated before the company's own legal department got involved, and, most damningly, the contractual clause, highlighted in bright red, that stated, any IP developed solely by an employee during employment. If the company failed to provide adequate resources or actively obstructed its development, would revert to the employee upon termination without cause. He added a short, polite message to the email. Dear Mr. Thompson, in response to your inquiry regarding Project Phoenix, please find attached a comprehensive record of the project's intellectual property, including its development timeline, resource allocation, and my personal contributions and investments. I trust this clarifies the ownership and development history of the project. Regards, Peter. He didn't send it immediately. He waited. He waited until the stock price dipped another point. He waited until he received another panicked message from Sarah detailing how Paul had personally tried to access his old project files and had been met with a system-wide lockout triggered by a security protocol he himself had designed as a final safeguard. Then, with a deliberate keystroke, he sent the email. The company's legal department had their response. The trap was sprung. They had sought to claim what wasn't theirs, and in doing so had provided Peter with the perfect opportunity to reclaim what rightfully belonged to him. The silence from the company's end was immediate and absolute. No replies, no counterarguments, just the deafening quiet of a corporate entity realizing it had walked headfirst into a meticulously laid ambush. They knew they were in trouble. They knew Peter was the architect of that trouble, but they still didn't grasp the full scale of the storm they had unleashed. The silence that followed Peter's email stretched for days, a heavy, suffocating blanket over the company. The initial panic had morphed into a low-grade dread. The integration issues with the logistics module continued to cripple operations, shipments were being rerouted, client trust was eroding, and the stock price was in freefall. Internal memos circulated like wildfire, each one a desperate, jargon-filled attempt to placate stakeholders and distract from the growing reality. Project Phoenix, the company's golden goose, was now a ghost, its creator gone, and its very foundation inexplicably crumbling. Paul, stripped of his usual bluster, was a portrait of barely contained fury and fear. Brenda, her crisp professionalism dissolving, was reportedly seen weeping in the office supply closet. The chief legal officer, Mr. Thompson, a man known for his bulldog tenacity, had gone radio silent. The silence wasn't acquiescence, it was the tense stillness before the storm, the collective held breath of a company realizing it had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Then, the call came. Peter was in his lab, meticulously cross-referencing his financial records with his coded development logs when his personal phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but the area code was local. He answered, his voice calm and steady. Hello? A strained, reedy voice, laced with a desperation that was palpable even through the static, responded. Is this Peter? Speaking, Peter replied, his tone neutral. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Peter, it's Nathan Altman, the CEO. We need to talk. Peter's lips curved into a faint smile. The top dog had finally descended from his ivory tower. Mr. Altman, to what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? Altman stammered, his carefully rehearsed composure fraying at the edges. Look, Peter, we received your email with the documentation. And frankly, we're confused. There seems to be some misunderstanding about the ownership of Project Phoenix. A misunderstanding, Mr. Altman? Peter leaned back in his chair, the low hum of his servers, a counterpoint to Altman's rising panic. I provided a comprehensive record. It outlines the development, the investment, the contractual obligations, and the IP reversion clause. Altman cleared his throat, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Yes, that clause. We understand it's complex, but the platform is vital to our company's future. It's our primary revenue stream. This is a significant crisis for us. We need a resolution. Peter paused, letting the weight of Altman's desperation hang in the air. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He hadn't sought revenge for the sake of vengeance. He sought justice, a restoration of balance, and now the scales were tilting dramatically in his favor. A resolution, Peter echoed, his voice measured. I believe I've already outlined the terms of a resolution. It's fairly straightforward. Straightforward? Altman practically choked out the word. Peter, you're talking about demanding control of our most critical asset. You can't just walk in here and claim the future of our company. With all due respect, Mr. Altman, Peter said, his tone firm but not aggressive. I didn't walk in. I meticulously documented my work, my investment, and my rights. You, on the other hand, walked out on the foundational principles of fair practice and intellectual property. You tried to steal my work, and when that failed, you tried to discredit me. My solution is simply the acknowledgement of reality. He let another beat of silence pass. However, he continued, his voice softening, because I believe in resolution and not simply destruction. I am willing to offer two paths forward. You can choose the one that best suits your company's future prospects. Altman's voice, though still shaky, held a flicker of hope. Two paths? What are they? Option A, Peter stated, his voice clear and unwavering, is what I would consider a repatriation of intellectual property. This involves the company formally acknowledging my sole ownership of Project Phoenix and its underlying technology. In return, I will license the technology back to your company. This would involve a substantial upfront payment, a significantly revised royalty agreement that reflects my sole authorship, and the immediate termination of Paul Harrison and Brenda Miller from their current positions. Furthermore, I would require a seat on the board of directors with veto power over any future decisions regarding Project Phoenix. He paused, allowing Altman to process the initial terms. They were steep, but they were fair, given the circumstances. The second option, Peter continued, his voice dropping slightly, is less collaborative. Should you choose not to accept, option A, I will proceed with filing a lawsuit for intellectual property theft, constructive dismissal, and reputational damage. This lawsuit will not only seek significant financial damages, but also injunctive relief that would prevent your company from utilizing any part of the Phoenix technology. This would likely lead to crippling fines, loss of key clients, and ultimately the potential dissolution of the company. The details of this will be presented to the SEC and relevant regulatory bodies within 48 hours of my decision to pursue this path. Altman was silent for a long moment, the only sound, the frantic clicking of his keyboard in the background. Peter imagined him staring at a spreadsheet. The numbers painted a grim, unavoidable picture. You can't do this, Altman finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. I can and I will, Mr. Altman, Peter replied calmly. The choice is yours. Your company's survival hinges on your decision. He hung up the phone, a sense of quiet completion settling over him. He hadn't needed to shout, to threaten, to rage. The evidence, the truth, and his own meticulous preparation had done the talking. The next day, Mr. Thompson, the chief legal officer, arrived at Peter's lab, not with a legal demand, but with a weary, defeated air. He carried a thick binder, its pages dog-eared and highlighted. He was a man who understood the law, and he understood the evidence Peter had presented. He looked at Peter, his eyes devoid of pretense. Mr. Lane, Thompson began, his voice gravelly, I've reviewed your documentation. It's comprehensive, and frankly, quite damning. The company, we've made a grave error. He opened the binder. Mr. Altman has authorized me to explore the terms of your proposal. Option A, as you've outlined it. Peter nodded. He had expected this. The corporate machine, when faced with irrefutable evidence and imminent financial ruin, was remarkably adept at self-preservation, even if it meant sacrificing its arrogant leaders. The negotiations that followed were swift and pragmatic. Altman, clearly overruled by the board and legal counsel, was a ghost in the process. His authority evaporated. Peter, armed with his meticulously crafted evidence and a clear understanding of his leverage, dictated the terms. The announcement came a week later, a brief, carefully worded press release that sent shockwaves through the tech industry. It spoke of a strategic realignment of intellectual property ownership and a new partnership with Peter Lane, who would now lead a newly formed division, Phoenix Innovations, focusing on advanced AI development. It also mentioned a voluntary departure of certain senior executives, a euphemism that everyone understood. Paul Harrison and Brenda Miller were gone, their careers in tatters, their reputations permanently tarnished by whispers of sabotage and IP theft, a silent testament to Peter's meticulous documentation. Peter's new office was not a sterile conference room, but a spacious, sunlit area overlooking the city. His name was on the door, bold and clear. He had his own team, a group of talented engineers who respected him, not for his title, but for his vision and his integrity. He had the resources he'd always needed and the freedom to innovate without fear of corporate reprisal. He looked out the window, a sense of profound satisfaction washing over him. He hadn't sought to destroy the company, but to reclaim what was his and to ensure that those who had attempted to steal his vision would face the consequences. He had proven that in the corporate world, silence, preparation, and irrefutable proof were the most powerful weapons of all. The game was over. Peter hadn't just won, he had redefined the rules. If watching corporate hubris meet its match and quiet competence triumph over arrogance fuels your fire, then make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of calculated justice. The lesson here is clear. They can fire you, but they can't erase your work. And if you play the long game with evidence and integrity, your comeback will be more devastating than their downfall.